I worked the night shift at a public library in Oregon for almost 2 years before this happened. Most people don't realize that a lot of public libraries stay open later than you'd expect. The one I worked at closed to the public at 9 p.m., but staff stayed until about 11 p.m. to finish returns, reshelving, and locking down the building. It was quiet work. Honestly, that was why I liked it. During the day the place was loud, kids, students, printers constantly running, but at night it became something else entirely. Once the doors locked and the last patron left, the building settled into a kind of heavy silence. You could hear everything. Air vents humming. Pages shifting in the return bins. The occasional creak from the old wooden floor in the history wing. Normally there were 3 of us working nights. But that Thursday in October it was just me. My coworker had called out sick and the security guard had been pulled to another city building for an event. So it was just me finishing closing procedures. That meant 2 things. Locking the internal floors and doing one last sweep of the building. The library had 3 levels. Main floor, circulation desk, computers, magazines. Second floor, study rooms and reference section. Basement, archives and storage. The basement was always the worst part of closing. It wasn't creepy exactly, just old. Concrete walls. Long rows of metal shelves. Fluorescent lights that flickered like they were struggling to stay on. You had to walk the entire length to make sure no one was down there before locking the door. Usually it took about 5 minutes. I locked the front doors to the public at exactly 9 p.m. like always. Then I started sorting the return cart. Everything felt normal. Too normal actually. Because around 9:20 the phone rang. Not my personal phone. The internal desk phone. Which was strange because the front desk line should have already switched to voicemail after closing. I picked it up anyway. Library front desk. Silence. I waited. Sometimes people dial and hang up. But then I heard breathing. Slow. Right against the receiver. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. Hello? The breathing stopped. Then the line went dead. I checked the call screen expecting to see an external number. Instead, the display showed something that made absolutely no sense. Basement archive. I stared at it for a moment. That wasn't even a public extension. It was an internal phone used by staff when organizing archival boxes. And no one had been down there all evening. I told myself it was just a system glitch. Old phone lines. It happens. Still, I decided to do the basement sweep earlier than usual. Better to just check. The door to the basement sits behind the staff hallway. You need a key card to open it. I swiped mine. The lock clicked. When I pushed the door open, the stairwell lights came on automatically. That harsh fluorescent hum filled the narrow space. I started walking down. Every step echoed more than it should have. Libraries are quiet, but the basement felt different. Heavy. Like the air was thicker. Halfway down the stairs, I heard something. A faint sound. Metal moving. Like someone shifting a shelf. I stopped. Listen. Silence again. Hello? I called down the stairwell. No answer. I told myself the building was settling. Old foundations make noise. Still I continued down. The basement lights were already on when I reached the bottom. That was the first thing that bothered me. They shouldn't have been. We normally kept them off unless someone was working down there. The motion sensors would only trigger in specific aisles. But the entire floor was lit. Every row. Every aisle. I stepped onto the concrete floor. The hum of the lights was louder down here. It filled the space like static. I walked the first row of shelves. Old newspapers. City records. Archived magazines from the 1970s. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something strange. One of the rolling archive ladders had been moved. They sit on rails attached to the shelves. Usually they're parked at the ends. This one was sitting halfway down the row. Like someone had just stepped off it. I looked up. There were boxes stacked all the way to the ceiling. No movement. But something felt wrong. You know that feeling when someone is standing just outside your field of vision? That was exactly what it felt like. Like I wasn't alone down there. I continued checking the aisles. Row by row. Trying to act normal. Trying not to think about the phone call. When I reached the last aisle near the back wall, I heard the metal sound again. This time it was unmistakable. The ladder behind me moved. Not a lot. Just enough for the wheels to scrape against the rail. I turned around quickly. The ladder was swaying. Gently. Back and forth. Like it had just been pushed. I stared at it. No one was there. "Hello?" I said again. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps, but not on the concrete. Above me, the main floor. Slow footsteps walking directly across the ceiling overhead. That made no sense. I had already locked the front doors. No one could have come in. And even if they had, they would have had to pass the desk. But the footsteps continued. Slow. Measured. Walking across the entire length of the building above me. Then they stopped. Directly above where I was standing. The fluorescent lights flickered once. Then went steady again. That was enough for me. I started heading back toward the stairs. But as I walked past the rows of shelves again, something caught my eye. One of the archive boxes had been pulled slightly out from the shelf. Just a few inches. Like someone had started to remove it. I hadn't noticed that earlier. I stepped closer. There was a label on the box. Local Incident Reports. 1978 to 1982. For some reason I felt the urge to push it back in. Just to straighten the shelf. But when I touched the box, I noticed something else. It was warm. Not room temperature. Warm. Like someone had been holding it moments ago. That was the moment I heard breathing again. Not through a phone this time. Right behind me. Close enough that I could feel the air shift. I froze. Slowly turned around. There was no one there. Just the empty aisle stretching toward the far wall. But the ladder at the end of the row was moving again. This time sliding slowly along the rail. By itself. Metal wheels scraping quietly. Stopping about 10 feet from me. Then the lights flickered again. And for just a second the aisle went dark. Total darkness. When the lights came back on, something was different. The box I had touched was gone. The shelf space where it had been was empty. I stared at it, confused. I knew exactly where it had been sitting. But now there was nothing there. Just the dust outline of the box that used to occupy the space. I heard the breathing again. But this time it wasn't behind me. It was above me. From the ceiling. Like someone was standing directly overhead. Listening. I didn't check the rest of the basement. I walked straight to the stairs and went back up. Locked the basement door. Finished closing the building as fast as possible. And I didn't tell anyone about it. At least not that night. The next morning when the day staff arrived, I checked something. The phone system log. Internal calls get recorded. And there was an entry from the previous night. 9:21 p.m. Extension, basement archive. Call duration, 12 seconds. But that wasn't the part that bothered me. The part that bothered me was the timestamp. Because according to the building access logs, the basement door had never been opened after 6:03 p.m. that evening. And I didn't go down there until 9:24. Meaning the call from the basement came from a place no one had entered for more than 3 hours. I didn't work nights much longer after that. But the part that still bothers me is something I learned later. About a week after the incident, one of the archivists mentioned something while we were reorganizing storage. Apparently years ago, long before I worked there, a volunteer had been found dead in the basement archives. Collapsed between the shelves while cataloging old boxes. They said it had been a heart attack. But when they found him, he was holding a box of local incident reports from the late 70s. And when I asked which box it was, she told me the exact same label I saw that night. Local Incident Reports. 1978 to 1982. The same box that disappeared from the shelf. And the one thing no one has been able to explain is this. That box still hasn't been located anywhere in the building. When Daniel Ortiz accepted the night custodian job at Westbridge Public Library, he assumed it would be the quietest job he'd ever had. The building was massive, 3 floors above ground and a small basement used for storage and maintenance. During the day it was full of students, researchers and families. But after midnight the place emptied completely. Daniel liked that. Silence helped him think. His shift started at 11:30 p.m. His job was simple. Clean the main floors, empty trash bins and check that everything was locked before morning staff arrived. The first few nights were exactly what he expected. Quiet. Boring. But on the 4th night, something strange happened. At around 1:15 a.m., Daniel finished mopping the 2nd floor and headed down the back staircase toward the basement storage area. The basement was narrow and dim. Only a few overhead lights stayed on at night, leaving most of the space in shadow. As he reached the bottom step, he heard something. A soft sound. Like a book sliding across wood. Daniel stopped. The basement reading archive was closed at night, and nobody was supposed to be down there. He waited. The sound stopped. He assumed it was just the building settling. Old pipes, shifting shelves, something normal. He shrugged and went to the janitor closet. But when he stepped back into the hallway a few minutes later, he heard it again. This time it was clearer. A slow scraping noise. From deeper in the basement. Daniel followed the sound down the narrow corridor that led toward the old archive storage room. That part of the basement wasn't used much anymore. Most of the books had been digitized, so the shelves down there were filled with outdated collections and dusty boxes. The corridor lights flickered faintly. The scraping sound stopped the moment Daniel turned the corner. The archive room door stood slightly open. He frowned. That door was supposed to be locked. Daniel pushed it open. Inside, rows of tall metal shelves stretched into the dark. Dust hung in the air. Everything looked undisturbed. Except one thing. A single book was lying on the floor in the center of the aisle. Daniel walked over and picked it up. The cover was faded leather. The title read, Municipal Records, 1968. Strange thing was, the shelf it belonged to was nearly 10 feet away. He placed the book back where it belonged and turned to leave. And then he heard something behind him. A slow exhale. Daniel spun around. The aisle behind him was empty. For the next hour, nothing else happened. Daniel finished cleaning and went upstairs to empty the final trash bins. But the silence in the building felt different now. He kept thinking about that sound. That breath. Around 3:40 a.m., he decided to do one final walkthrough of the basement before ending his shift. He told himself it was just to be thorough. But really he wanted to prove to himself nothing was wrong. When he reached the basement again, the hallway lights flickered once. Then steadied. Everything looked the same. Daniel walked toward the archive room. But something made him stop halfway down the corridor. There was a door on the right side of the hallway. A metal service door. He had never noticed it before. Daniel stared at it. He had walked this hallway every night that week. He was certain that door hadn't been there. The sign on it read, Lower Archive, Authorized Access Only. Daniel frowned. He had never been told about another archive level. He pulled out his phone and checked the library floor map that had been emailed to staff. The basement layout showed only 3 rooms. The janitor closet, the maintenance room, and the archive. There was no door. No lower level. Nothing. Daniel approached the door slowly. A faint sound was coming from the other side. Not scraping. Something softer. Pages turning. Very slowly. One page. Then another. Like someone sitting in a quiet room, reading. Daniel pressed his ear to the door. The page turning stopped immediately. Silence filled the hallway. Daniel stepped back. Hello, he said. No answer. He grabbed the door handle. It turned easily. The room beyond wasn't a room. It was a stairwell. A narrow concrete staircase descending into darkness. The air rising from below was cold. Much colder than the rest of the basement. Daniel hesitated. The lights down there were on, but very dim. After a moment he started down. Each step echoed softly. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. And the stronger the smell of old paper grew. At the bottom of the stairs was another hallway. Long. And lined with wooden bookshelves. Every shelf was packed with books. Thousands of them. Dust covered everything. But the floor had footprints. Fresh ones. Daniel stepped into the hallway. The lights above buzzed faintly. Every few seconds he heard a soft sound somewhere between the shelves. Page turning. Footsteps. A whisper of movement. But whenever he turned toward the noise, nothing was there. He checked the nearest shelf. The books weren't labeled like normal library books. Their titles were strange. Missing Persons, 1972. Incident Reports, Restricted. Uncatalogued Records. Daniel pulled one from the shelf. Inside were newspaper clippings. Police reports. Old photographs. All documenting people who had disappeared in the city over decades. Hundreds of cases. Some dating back nearly a century. Daniel flipped through the pages. And then he froze. One of the files had a photograph. A recent one. A security camera still. Taken inside the library. The date at the bottom read, 3 nights ago. The person in the image was Daniel. Standing in the basement hallway. His hands started shaking. He closed the file slowly. And then he heard footsteps behind him. Not echoes. Real footsteps. Moving between the shelves. Daniel turned. Hello? No answer. But the footsteps continued. Slow. Unhurried. Circling him. Daniel backed away from the shelves. Who's there? The footsteps stopped. Then a single book slid off a shelf across the room and hit the floor. The sound echoed through the archive. Daniel ran. He sprinted down the hallway toward the stairs. But halfway there he realized something. The staircase was gone. The wall where it should have been was solid concrete. Daniel stared at it in disbelief. He turned around. The hallway behind him looked longer now. The shelves stretched farther than before. And somewhere deep in the archive, pages began turning again. One after another. Dozens. Hundreds. Like an entire room of books opening at once. Daniel ran deeper into the hallway, searching for another exit. But every turn led to another aisle. More shelves. More files. More records. Each one filled with disappearances. Then he saw something on a table. A new folder. It hadn't been there before. Daniel approached it slowly. His name was written on the cover. Daniel Ortiz. Below it was a date. Tomorrow's date. His hands trembled as he opened the file. Inside was a photograph. Taken only seconds ago. Daniel standing in the aisle. Holding the folder. Looking directly at the camera. Behind him. Footsteps stopped. Very close. Daniel slowly turned around. But the aisle behind him was empty. No one was there. Nothing moved. The lights flickered once. Then the entire archive went dark. When the morning staff arrived at 8 a.m., they found the library completely empty. The janitor cart was still in the basement hallway. The mop bucket was half full. But Daniel Ortiz was gone. The security footage from that night showed him entering the basement at 3:42 a.m. But it never showed him coming back up. And according to the official building plans, there has never been a lower archive level beneath Westbridge Public Library. Everyone in Oak Ridge knew the public library closed at 10 p.m. The staff locked the doors, turned off most of the lights, and the entire building went dark except for the emergency exit signs. At least that's what people believed. But for years, a few night shift workers in nearby stores had quietly said something different. They said the library lights sometimes came back on after midnight, and sometimes, people were still inside. Maya Chin worked the overnight shift at a small pharmacy across the street from the Oak Ridge Public Library. Her shift ran from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. Most nights were painfully slow. Only a few late customers came in, and the rest of the time she sat behind the counter watching the empty street. The library sat directly across from the pharmacy's front windows. Big glass panels made it easy to see the entire first-floor reading area from outside. Normally at night the building was completely dark. But one night in late November, something caught Maya's attention. At 2:17 a.m., the library lights turned on. At first she assumed it was a maintenance crew. But as she watched, she realized something strange. Only the reading room lights were on. The rest of the building stayed dark. And there were people inside. At least 5 of them. They were sitting at the long reading tables with books open in front of them. They weren't moving. Not turning pages. Not speaking. Just sitting there. Maya frowned. It didn't make sense. The library had closed 4 hours earlier. And she hadn't seen anyone enter. The next night she watched again. At exactly 2:17 a.m. the lights came on. The same 5 people sat at the same tables. In the exact same positions. One man leaned forward with his elbows on the table. A woman sat perfectly upright with a book open in front of her. 2 people sat side by side near the window. And one person sat alone at the back table facing the wall. None of them moved. For almost 20 minutes, Maya stared at them. Not one page turned. Not one head shifted. Nothing. Then at 2:36 a.m., the lights shut off. And the room went completely dark again. Maya asked her manager about it the following evening. He laughed it off. Probably some late cleaning crew. But Maya knew that wasn't true. Cleaning crews moved. They vacuumed. They pushed carts. These people had been completely still. The third night, Maya decided to walk across the street. Just to look closer. At 2:10 a.m., she left the pharmacy and crossed the empty road. The library doors were locked. The building was dark. She waited outside. Then at 2:17 a.m. exactly, the lights inside flicked on. The reading room appeared instantly. and the 5 people were already sitting there. They hadn't entered. They hadn't walked in. They were just suddenly there. Maya stepped closer to the glass. The man closest to the window was only a few feet away now. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused on anything. He stared straight ahead, completely motionless. Maya tapped lightly on the glass. The sound echoed faintly inside. None of them reacted. Not even a blink. She knocked harder. Still nothing. It was like they couldn't hear her, or couldn't move. Then something made Maya step back. One of the people at the far table had changed position. The person who had been facing the wall was now facing the window, directly toward her. Maya was sure they hadn't moved. She had been staring at them the entire time. But now their chair pointed straight at the glass, and they were looking right at her. Their face was pale, too pale, and their eyes looked strange, wide open, unblinking. Maya felt a sudden wave of unease. She stepped backward from the window, and as she did, the person at the table slowly stood up, very slowly. The chair didn't scrape the floor. It didn't make any sound at all. The figure simply rose and began walking toward the window. Maya's heart started racing. The figure moved strangely, not like a normal person walking. Their steps were stiff, unnatural. As they got closer, Maya realized something even worse. The other 4 people were now standing too. All of them, at the exact same time. All of them walking toward the window. Maya turned and ran back across the street. She didn't stop until she reached the pharmacy door. When she looked back at the library, the figures were still walking toward the glass. Slowly, silently. Then the lights shut off, and they vanished into darkness. Maya didn't sleep much the next day, but curiosity pulled her back to the window again that night. At 2:17 a.m., the lights came on. The 5 people were back at the tables. Exactly like before. Exactly the same positions. But something was different now. One of the chairs was empty. The chair closest to the window. The one the first man had been sitting in. Now it was vacant. 4 people remained. Maya's stomach tightened. She counted again. 4. The 5th chair sat empty. The book in front of it was still open, its pages unmoving. The following night, Maya forced herself not to look. But at 2:17 a.m. she couldn't help it. She glanced out the window. The lights were on again. 3 people remained. Another chair was empty. The book stayed open, but the readers were disappearing, one by one. Each night, Maya started researching the library's history. She found old news articles from decades ago. One article mentioned a group of graduate students who had stayed late studying in the reading room during a winter storm. 5 of them. They had been reported missing. Their belongings were found inside the library the next morning. But the students themselves were never located. The case had remained unsolved for 30 years. That night, Maya watched again. 2 people remained. The chairs around them sat empty. But the books were still open, still waiting. The next night, 1 person remained. The woman sitting upright with the open book. She didn't move, didn't turn the page, just stared at the same line of text. Maya felt a deep dread she couldn't explain. She stayed behind the pharmacy counter, refusing to go outside this time. At 2:17 a.m., the lights came on. The woman was still there, alone, reading. At 2:29 a.m., the woman slowly closed the book. For the first time since Maya had seen them, someone moved naturally. The woman stood up and turned toward the window, toward the pharmacy, toward Maya. Even from across the street, Maya could feel the woman staring directly at her. Then the woman began walking toward the library doors. Maya backed away from the window. Her hands were shaking. A moment later, she heard something that made her freeze. The pharmacy door handle rattled. Once, twice. Then slowly, it turned. Maya stood completely still. The door opened a few inches. Cold air drifted inside. No one was standing there. The street outside was empty. But the library across the road was now dark. The lights had turned off. Maya slowly approached the door. The night was silent. Too silent. Then she looked down. On the pharmacy floor, a library book lay open, right inside the doorway. The pages turned slowly on their own, as if someone invisible were reading it. And when Maya looked at the title, her blood ran cold. The book was a missing persons record.